The last time I spoke about Final Fantasy XVI on my channel, it was in the context of a controversy surrounding Yoshi P, the game's producer. He made a comment to the effect that Japanese developers no longer like using the term JRPG, which caused a whole firestorm. But that video was about the game's pre-release controversy, and since then, Final Fantasy XVI has come out, been pretty well received by most people, and is considered to be a contender for Game of the Year at the VGAs. Though personally, I don't think it's going to beat out either Baldur's Gate 3 or Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. In fact, I think Zelda's got it in the bag, but if you watch my video on that, you'd probably already know that I'm pretty biased. Nonetheless, Final Fantasy XVI is a pretty good game. It's not an amazing game, this isn't a return to the days when Final Fantasy was a system seller, but it's certainly better than Final Fantasy X or 12 or 13. Here's my general review of the game. I won't spoil anything, so you have a chance to go and play it for yourself if you haven't already, but the background footage I'm using is a random selection of the game's side quests, so be warned. Final Fantasy XVI's story has been described as Game of Thrones-like by a lot of reviewers, and with good reason. It's got that same type of gritty realism that Game of Thrones thrived off of. Lots of violence and sexuality, political drama between noble families, medieval warfare. The first half of the game genuinely feels like dark fantasy. The second half of the game, though, returns to more general Final Fantasy fare. You know, dealing with magic crystals and killing God, leaving behind a lot of the Game of Thrones elements in its storytelling. In terms of combat, Final Fantasy XVI plays like a game from the Devil May Cry series, which makes sense considering that the two games share staff. The combat is entirely action-oriented, nothing turn-based whatsoever, and the game is full of flashy, relatively easy-to-pull-off combos. The number of consecutive hits is displayed prominently on screen, incentivizing you to keep the combos rolling, as well as various multipliers for dodges or counters or cinematic events. Yes, cinematic. Our good old friend the QuickTime event makes a return. Climactic battles often see the player take control of large monsters, where their moves are replaced with more extreme variations. These are considered by most players to be some of the coolest parts of the game, and there's enough time between them that they don't overstay their welcome. Your character grows in power with level ups like in most RPGs, but the real advancement comes in the form of a skill tree. Unlocking more combat abilities is primarily done through spending your skill points, and more skill trees unlock at various points in the story. This is all very normal action RPG stuff at this point, nothing revolutionary here. The equipment system is pretty rudimentary, but it does the job well enough. Buying and upgrading items is also very normal. You find crafting materials out in the world, you upgrade your stuff. It's all very by the books. However, the equipment system was the source of the first post-launch controversy. Final Fantasy XVI includes Game Journo mode in the form of overpowered equipment that you have access to right from the start of the game. These are called the Timely Accessories. The Ring of Timely Strikes allows you to execute complex combos by simply tapping one button. The Ring of Timely Evasion turns on auto dodge. The Ring of Timely Focus turns on slow motion right before you're about to get hit. The Ring of Timely Healing turns on auto heal, meaning you'll automatically use a potion when you lose health. And the Ring of Timely Assistance will have your dog companion, Torgal, act in combat without having to give him commands. These items are pretty cheap on their own, but then some people out there tried to make the argument that Final Fantasy XVI was shit, most of them repeatedly posting this clip of some dumbass streaming the game, holding the controller with one hand and button mashing one button while eating. This was apparently supposed to be proof that the game sucked, but it turned out he was just using the Game Journo items. The game has an unhideable UI element right above the HP meter, so you can always tell if somebody's using these items. The developers specifically said it was so that people couldn't hide their use of the item online, which is pretty funny since so many people fell into that trap. Speaking of the dog acting in combat without commands, you do get a few party members, but they add almost nothing to the game. Yeah, they're characters with personalities, and you do care about them, at least if you care about the story, but in terms of what they actually bring to the fight, most of the time they're just slowly auto-attacking in the background. The dog is by far the most useful, and by that I mean not at all. It's not like in Final Fantasy XV, where the AI-controlled characters actually contribute quite a bit, or like in the Final Fantasy VII Remake, where you can actually switch focus and play as them. Nope, in this game your guys just sit around and lightly swing their weapons once every 5 seconds or so. You will be doing 99% of the damage in Final Fantasy XVI. Nonetheless, it's still pretty cool to see them represented as little Final Fantasy VI style sprites in the save and load screens. Game design is where Final Fantasy XVI starts to get a little bit shaky. The story's pretty good, but we've surpassed Metal Gear Solid's 4 cutscene length at this point. You'll be watching at least 20 minutes of dialogue and lore-heavy cutscenes after every main story mission. Some of them are actually quite gripping, which is what you want if you have to lose control of the game that you're playing for what is the length of time of a block of TV programming. But others are just really, really boring, almost insufferable. The writing's very hit or miss. It really feels like they crafted a very intricate lore for this world, and threw the vast majority of it into logs you have to read, or even worse, in the game's lore menu, while there's many missed opportunities for environmental or contextual storytelling with the settings and characters. The side quests are almost all boring fetch quests. In fact, even a good chunk of the main quests in between climactic fights are just fetch quests too. The level design is not quite as bad as the legendarily awful Final Fantasy XIII's hallways, but it is pretty close. This world is not like the wide open area of Final Fantasy XV, full of cool things to check out on the horizon. Many of the levels are just hallways. Monster encounters in the hallway, treasure chests in the hallway, cutscenes in the hallway. When the hallway does open up slightly, it's a boss arena, before narrowing back down into a hallway once again. Side quests have you running up and down the hallways. Sometimes the hallways crisscross over each other, but there's never anything approaching a maze or a dungeon. Occasionally, the game opens up into a large field you can explore, usually accompanied by a handful of side quests from the latest town that take you to multiple areas of interest. And these places are pretty fun for a little while, but functionally they are just wider hallways. There's one way in and one way out. The saving grace for the game's side content is the hunt board. Particularly ferocious monsters have a bounty placed on their head, and if you bring them in, you claim the reward. They're the most engaging non-story fights in the game, and they're a lot of fun to do. All in all, Final Fantasy XVI is a good game, but it doesn't break into excellent territory. It's still worth playing, absolutely, but if you were thinking of picking up a PS5 just for this game, no. Wait until it comes out in Steam, maybe wait for a sale. Like every new game coming out nowadays, though, somebody on the internet got mad at it for some stupid reason. To talk about that, though, I'm gonna have to start spoiling parts of the game. So if for some reason you were only here for my review of it and you want to play it for yourself, now's your chance to skedaddle. Before Final Fantasy XVI launched, Yoshi P announced that there would be no black people in the game. His reasoning was that the game's setting was inspired by medieval Europe, and black people simply didn't fit into his vision of the game's various kingdoms. Having now finished the game, I'll confirm that yes, there are no black people in the world of Valisthea. The expansionist Empire of Sembrek, the isolationist Kingdom of Waloed, and the tiny Duchy of Rosaria all appear to be vaguely based on various European feudal realms, while the Iron Kingdom to the west is a pirate kingdom. Each of these locations are home to a different ethnic group in the lore, but they all look European. The Dalmekian Republic to the south is the only nation with an elected parliament. They appear to be vaguely Arab or Turkic, with notably different architecture, customs, food, and environment than the rest of the game world. It seems like the game designers wanted to make the continent feel like Europe with all of its squabbling kingdoms, and just on the edge of European understanding was the Middle East with its alien ideas. And you know what? They did a pretty good job at it. Yeah, the Middle East wasn't and still isn't democratic, but you get the point. This is a story that the West can intuitively pick up on from our own cultural background, but it also doesn't really have room for random black people to simply exist as background peasants, like we're watching the Rings of Power or something. These are ethnically homogenous societies, not mixed interracial ones. But the usual progressive suspects got very, very angry at the state of affairs. Their outrage mirrored the reaction to Kingdom Come Deliverance years ago, where that game was set in a historically accurate kingdom of Bohemia in 1403, meaning no ethnic non-European characters were featured in the game. Final Fantasy XVI has no business abiding by historical realism. Final Fantasy XVI has a medieval approach to diversity. Final Fantasy XVI developer has a terrible answer as to why the game is so white. Yoshi P's answer is pretty obvious to anybody who's not ideologically motivated, but it's an answer that game journals just can't accept. Here's what he said about it in the interview. This is a difficult question, but not one that was unexpected, seeing as diversity in entertainment media has become a much discussed topic as of late. The answer I have, however, may end up being disappointing to some, depending on individual expectations. Rather than create something on a global scale, it was necessary to limit the scope to a single landmass, one geographically and culturally isolated from the rest of the world, in an age without airplanes, television, or phones. Due to the underlying geographical, technological, and geopolitical constraints of this setting, Valisthea was never going to realistically be as diverse as, say, modern-day Earth, or even Final Fantasy XIV, that has an entire planet and moon worth of nations, races, and cultures at its disposal. The isolated nature of this realm, however, does end up playing a large part in the story. Ultimately, we felt that while incorporating ethnic diversity into Valisthea was important, an over-incorporation into the single corner of a much larger world could end up causing a violation of those narrative boundaries we originally set for ourselves. The story we are telling is fantasy, yes, but it's also rooted in reality. In the end, we simply want the focus to be less on the outward appearance of our characters and more on who they are as people. People who are complex and diverse in their natures, backgrounds, beliefs, personalities, and motivations. People whose stories we can resonate with. There is diversity in Valisthea. Diversity that, while not all-encompassing, is synergistic with the setting we've created and is true to the inspirations from which we're drawing. How do you think the Progs took this? From The Verge, this idea of Final Fantasy XVI being rooted in reality is likely going to end up hurting the developer's other, arguably more important goal for the game, which is to reach as big of an audience as possible. You know, based on those sales numbers, I don't think that ended up being a problem. Over at Kotaku, it made them go, yikes, in real life. And you know what? Maybe this is why y'all didn't get a review copy of the game. Between this and Nintendo and Bethesda and Ubisoft, all blacklisting Kotaku for publishing leaked info, does Kotaku get any review copies of anything anymore? So, the progs were mad that there weren't black characters in the game. It's not like Final Fantasy has a history of only having white characters. Far from it, in fact. But after the game came out, their ire rapidly shifted in a pretty ironic way. Final Fantasy XVI suffers from its superficial handling of slavery. We need to talk about slavery in Final Fantasy XVI. Final Fantasy XVI fails its players and its world with its misguided treatment of slavery. Yeah, the game's got a fair bit of slavery in it, as well as open prostitution, another of its thematic ties to Game of Thrones. Here's the explanation of how magic works in Final Fantasy XVI. There are these giant mountains of crystal called the Mother Crystals. Pieces of crystal are mined off of these mountains and can be used to cast simple magic. Everything in Valisthea operates off of crystals. Street lamps, forges, water wells, crystals do it all. Bearers are people who are randomly born with the ability to cast magic without the use of a crystal. However, doing so causes their body to slowly turn to stone. Bearers are treated differently in each society. In the Iron Kingdom, bearers are killed immediately as they're an affront to their religion. In Rosaria, bearers are culturally looked down upon, but treated as valued servants. Not equal, and certainly sometimes mistreated, but also generally not treated cruelly by their masters. In Sanbreque, bearers are chattel, used for labor until the curse renders them unable to cast magic, and then discarded. In overseas nations outside of the continent of Valisthea, bearers who are sold there are treated extremely well, as those locations don't have mother crystals, and therefore they have no other way to access magic. The exception to this rule are the dominants, family lineages who can not only use magic, but transform into giant monsters known as icons. They can nonetheless still fall victim to the Curse of Stone. The dominants aren't relevant to the slavery conversation, though. In Final Fantasy XVI's world, the bearers occupy some kind of slave class or other type of underclass status in the various realms of Valisthea. They're not the only source of magic, so they can't just take over with their power. Regular humans can still use crystals. But having somebody who can cast magic without a crystal is pretty convenient. They're also rare and born at random. The state tracks every pregnancy and tests every child to see if they're bearers. It works a lot like the Jedi Order, in fact. If a child is discovered to be a bearer, they're taken by the state and placed into a life of slavery. Most parents are actually happy to have their child taken like this, as culturally being the parent of a bear is considered embarrassing. For the majority of the game, you play as a revolutionary who not only wants to overthrow the various monarchies on the continent in the name of equality, but also destroy the mother crystals and abolish magic in order to free the bearers. The progressive complaints about Final Fantasy XVI revolve around the idea that this storyline, where the bearers are a slave class, is not treated with the undue care and respect that they believe it deserves. Instead of wasting time with large block quotes from the articles, let me just summarize to you their arguments. 1. The protagonist of the game, Clive Rossfield, is a member of the royal family of Rosaria. He's not a bearer in the traditional sense. He was given fire magic due to the blessing of his younger brother, Joshua, the dominant of fire. At least that's what everyone initially thinks. It's actually a late-game plot twist. They do something else entirely. But dominants can give non-magicked humans access to bearer-like magic, so it's a reasonable assumption. After Clive's mother betrays her country to Sanbreque and orchestrates an attack on her own family, I told you we'd be spoiling stuff at this point, Clive is presumed dead. His identity is legally erased, and he's sold into slavery as any other bearer. Despite this, the game doesn't really show the impact of slavery on Clive, even after he's been freed and meets up with Cid, the leader of the revolutionaries fighting to end slavery. I don't agree with this criticism. Clive is noble and energetic when we see him as a teenager, and he's sullen and defeatist as an adult. And this is likely due not only to the loss of his family and country, but also to his current lot in life. We don't need to be shown the 13 years of Clive's torture. We can see it in his personality. When he first encounters Cid's little terrorist cell, Clive's attitude is one of, this is just the way the world is and we can't change it. And over the course of the game, he comes around to the idea that Cid's quest to end slavery in Valisthea is a moral one. When Cid dies at the game's midpoint, Clive takes on his name and continues his operation. And while him parroting Cid's viewpoint exactly down to the word is a bit on the nose, we understand that he's come around. Clive has the life experience of both highborn and low at this point. And unlike these articles, I don't think he's driven solely to honor Cid's memory. That's part of it, but I also think that Clive's been genuinely convinced of Cid's position. Of course, Clive's interest in abolishing the slavery he sees and personally experienced does take a hard back seat to the whole killing God thing as the game ramps up. But hey, when the villain aiming at you is God, maybe emancipation has to wait a little longer. 2. The game journals view the game's solution to slavery as assimilationist. It's Cid's plan to destroy the Mother Crystals and abolish magic, which Clive continues after his death. Sid's assumption is that if magic were abolished, then the bears would have no reason to continue being enslaved. This is stupid. There's no reason the nobles wouldn't just keep the slaves they've already got, since they're already enslaved, and put them to physical work instead, like slavery in the real world. Additionally, it places the burden of change on the enslaved. It says if you didn't have this quality, you wouldn't be a slave. The solution is to therefore remove the quality and make you like everyone else. The people who own slaves are certainly depicted by the game as morally reprehensible, but the solution the game's plot offers is less behead the slaver and more change the slave. Unlike the first criticism, this one actually has some weight, and I personally agree with it. But it's a very non-leftist type of analysis, isn't it? This isn't the argument of a political realist, of somebody who's employing some type of historical materialist analysis to the world of Final Fantasy XVI. A leftist view of the game's setting would reveal the economic forces at play. Magic is valuable. It's a method of generating more value with less labor, like using higher quality tools or machines in the real world. But since the bears cast magic without the use of tools, they themselves are the means of production. Looking at Final Fantasy XVI through a Marxist lens, the option of abolish magic suddenly makes a lot more sense, as doing so changes the relationship of the people with the means of production. The purely moral argument of it doesn't matter what the status of magic is or how valuable bearers are, slavery is evil, while certainly true, is a position you can't arrive at solely through a materialist analysis. Rather, moral intuitions are its source, which means Jonathan Haidt, which means evolutionary psychology. And most leftists decry evolutionary psychology as biologically essentialist, therefore eugenicist, therefore fascist and evil. I don't think progressive games journalists are educated enough to follow the chain of logic here, but I'm sure you get it. TLDR, the second criticism is correct, but it's strange to see leftoids use it because they reject all of its logical foundations. 3. The vast majority of the game that focuses on the plight of the bears is side content, and you can go the whole game without even seeing it. This is, again, true. I remember one side quest where a minor noble family was buying bears and having them get ripped apart by dogs for fun. They buy Clive, and being the main character badass he is, you kill the dogs. Angered by this, they resolve to buy even more vicious dogs and show you what's what, only to have the dogs immediately turn on them and rip them apart. It is exactly as ham-fisted as it sounds. Another side quest in the same area has a noble child hire you to find her pet Chloe. You discover that Chloe wasn't a dog or something, but a bear who had turned to stone due to using too much magic. The child had owned several bears, naming them all Chloe, but had rode each of them too hard. She doesn't even seem to recognize that Chloe was a person, and she considers the whole affair an annoyance now that she has to buy a new one. The progressive complaint is because all of this stuff is side content, players don't actually have to face the reality of bears in this world. They can simply skip the quests, which is the video game equivalent of turning a blind eye to injustice. This is a dumb critique. I still don't like this stuff personally, but for a different reason. Quests like these serve to outline just how bad bears have it in this world, but they are comedically, simplistically evil. The people who abuse bears are Saturday morning cartoon villains. In the real world, attitudes towards slavery weren't so cut and dry. There absolutely were some real shitheels who just did not give a fuck and worked them to death and raped them and all the rest of it. There were also people who believed that they were doing a good thing by owning slaves. A common belief in the American South was that black people simply were not capable of self-governance and needed to be ruled the same way that parents rule their children. For some of them, this was simply a post hoc justification of their exploitation, but others genuinely believed it. That doesn't make what they did morally acceptable, obviously, I'm not saying that, but the person who is factually extremely wrong about the nature of his fellow man is not the same kind of person who is sadistically evil and aware of himself. Further still are the people who owned slaves while wanting slavery abolished, like many of America's founding fathers. They believed that while slavery was evil, as long as it was legal, they couldn't afford to not employ slaves in their businesses. If they took a moral stance and refused to use slave labor, they would find themselves at a consistent disadvantage against their less moral competitors. Their belief was that until the system itself was changed, they had no choice but to own slaves, as individual action in a vacuum would simply mean their own destruction. Again, this doesn't make it right, far from it. And maybe some of these people actually were also sadistic fucks who used this as a cover story. Who knows? But surely, at least some of them weren't. The point I'm making is that the lack of nuance in Final Fantasy XVI's slavery story makes it ridiculous. Every slave is the purest saint. Every slave owner is the absolute worst person with no redeeming qualities or really no characterization at all beyond just loving to pig fuck their slaves. But that isn't the game journal's critique. Their view is that the story isn't black and white enough, and also that you can just skip over it. Speaking of black and white, they've completely forgotten about the whole no black people complaint from back before the game came out. Man, can you imagine how that would have unfolded? Imagine an inclusively added black noble family treating a white enslaved bearer like shit. It would make sense in terms of Valisthea's class dynamics, but I can already imagine their headlines. Final Fantasy XVI's racially insensitive scene ignores the real-world racism. These people really do just exist to hate on things that fall outside of the bounds of their politics. Not even explicitly against their politics, just not explicitly for it. I wonder if that's why IGN recently published an article implying that Final Fantasy XVI caused Square Enix to take a massive financial hit, when in reality it was Square's other bombs, like the Avengers game and Forspoken, that lost them money, with Final Fantasy XVI's success being the only one of their properties keeping them afloat right now. I'll give you one final Devian leap of logic before we wrap this up. All of these articles complaining about the Final Fantasy XVI treatment of slavery as a topic, they all handwave the whole killing God part of the story. To them it's an afterthought, like, oh, the plight of the bearers takes second fiddle to the usual Final Fantasy schlock. And fair enough. But I'll tell you why I think all of these articles fail to go into that half of the story in detail. In their view, the whole Sid and Clive end slavery and overthrow the monarchy, that's a fundamentally leftist storyline. Reject the hereditary nobility, power to the people, French Revolution style. And Sid's ragtag crew contains a whole bunch of different types of people, different ethnicities, nobles and commoners alike, all working hard to accomplish that goal. Clive goes on and on about freedom and liberation and being down with the cause. It's the ideal lefty power fantasy. But when the plot shifts towards the killing God stuff in the second half, the ethic of the story also dramatically shifts. The use of magic causes blight on the land. Life force is sucked up from the land to cast spells, slowly killing everything. Yes, Final Fantasy as a series has a few core themes, and the idea of magic as a stand-in for fossil fuels and a pending ecological disaster resulting from its use by humans failing to maintain a balance with nature, that is a consistent one across most of the games in the series. The god in the game that we're fighting against is actually an alien being named Ultima, who traveled to the planet the game takes place on, having destroyed his own world through overusing magic. After realizing that the blight was appearing on this new world too, Ultima devised a plan. He created the Mother Crystals, he created humanity, and then he entombed parts of himself inside the Mother Crystals. As humanity discovered magic, the blight would spread, but the spent magical energy would channel through the core of the Mother Crystals, Ultima's entombed parts. Eventually, humanity would produce an ideal vessel through which unlimited magic could be channeled, which Ultima could then possess, seeing as he's a disembodied spirit. Naturally, this person is Clive. The story's not exactly clear on this next bit, but it's heavily implied that the capacity for consciousness is a key component of the spread of the blight. Humans, with will, casting magic, causes the land's aether to be consumed and lost, spreading blight. But an overabundance of aether in one location, a problem in the other direction, causes all the life forms in the affected area to lose their will, becoming what the game calls akashic. In terms of game mechanics, this just means that there's stronger variants of regular enemies. But in terms of the story, Akashic creatures are philosophical zombies. A philosophical zombie is a thought experiment, where a person behaves like any other person but has no conscious experience. For example, if I were to poke you with a sharp stick, you would presumably feel pain and then react accordingly. But if I were to poke a philosophical zombie, while it might react exactly like you did, it would feel no pain, as it doesn't have the capacity for it. You could talk to a philosophical zombie, and it would talk back to you like a real human, but there's no consciousness behind the eyes there. It's simply an acting and reacting automaton. In colloquial speech, the difference between a person and a philosophical zombie is that a person has a soul, while a philosophical zombie doesn't. It's simply acting like it does. It's going through extremely complicated, identical to humans, but ultimately pre-programmed responses. The point of the thought experiment is that it's one of the common results of having ultimate skepticism. You can't know if other people are having a conscious experience like yours, because you can't access it. While you do know that your own consciousness exists because you are literally it, you don't know with perfect accuracy if anybody else's does. You might be the only real person, and everybody else is just a philosophical zombie, a meat puppet. Now, you know what? That's not true, because obviously I'm the main character. You guys cease to exist the minute we stop talking. This is what's being expressed by that kinda creepy "Divine Light is Severed" meme from Cruelty Squad, where the caption says, "Divine Light Severed. You are a flesh automaton animated by neurotransmitters." I don't know much about Cruelty Squad, but from what I can gather, this caption appears when you die and you're brought back to life. A new body is made and given your memories in the story, and since you're aware of this process, you know that you're not really you. You're just a facsimile meant to be indistinguishable from the previous you. This meme gained a lot of traction because of its real-world implications in the postmodern age. Before the Enlightenment, humans understood themselves as divine beings, connected to God, and therefore they had a telos, making their actions a necessary part of putting the cosmos in order. But in the age of modern science, we've opened the hood on a lot of what makes us tick. And while we don't have ultimate understanding of everything yet, we do know that there probably isn't a soul, that consciousness is an emergent property of our brains and their firing neurotransmitters. Oh, real quick, I guess. An emergent property is a thing that doesn't exist in isolation, but does exist as a result of the interaction between other systems that do exist. For example, in economics, the market doesn't exist, but it's a property that emerges when individual consumers make choices in a decentralized way. As a result of people buying and selling products at their own preferred rates of exchange, a market emerges, with efficient pricing based on supply and demand. If the people stop trading, the market vanishes, but the market exists as long as the people keep interacting with each other. The formation of snowflakes, the shape of flying flocks of birds, the behavior of traffic jams, these are all emergent properties. The pattern doesn't exist on its own, but it comes into existence when individuals do what they would normally do. Human consciousness is, as far as we can tell, an emergent property. There's no soul there. It seems like consciousness exists as a result of the various brain systems operating together in the way that they do. In fact, an extremely pessimistic view of this discovery is that we're all actually philosophical zombies. Yes, even you, even if you think you know your own consciousness. We're all just flesh automatons animated by neurotransmitters with no real consciousness, no divine light, and that what we think our consciousness is actually just a perception trick that our brains pull on us, and that what lies beneath the extremely thin surface is actually just a bunch of biologically pre-programmed and environmentally learned responses to stimuli. Well, ignoring that dark turn, going back to Final Fantasy XVI, Akashic creatures are lore-wise actually philosophical zombies. They're empty husks, simply reacting as their biology leads them around, with no semblance of understanding or consciousness. When animals become Akashic, they tend to live in unison and harmony with other Akashic creatures, even if one was a predator of the other normally. When humans become Akashic, they just stand around in one place waiting for stimuli. But all of them attack non-Akashic life on sight. Ultima can control Akashic creatures with his mind, making them march in unison or attack with strategy. And when Akashic creatures use magic, the land's aether is not wasted, but collected. If humans, with will, casting magic, cause that magic to be expended and expand the blight, humans without will casting magic conserves the land's magic, causing it to concentrate. So Ultima's plan is to accelerate the spread of blight to weaken the planet's life, and then turn them Akashic with concentrated magic, allowing them to be empty vessels for his purposes. And Clive's body as the ultimate empty vessel he'll possess, allowing himself to cast magic without causing blight. The end result of Ultima's plan is what he considers a utopian society. All life forms stripped of their free will, existing in an equality of emptiness, and as such they'll no longer be capable of destroying the planet. Ultima himself lives on in Clive's body, using it to cast magic as he wishes without causing blight, since the body itself is technically also willless. Don't worry, I haven't gotten lost in the weeds. I do actually remember that I'm supposed to be explaining why leftoids find this part of the story distasteful, as opposed to the whole overthrow the monarchy and liberate the slaves portion. The king of Waloed, the dominant of Odin, Barnabas Tharmir, is Ultima's right-hand man. He has willingly sold his soul, or his neurotransmitters, to Ultima, as he actually views Ultima as a god, and agrees that his vision of a world devoid of consciousness is the only way to stop the blight. Also, I guess having Ultima conjure up the naked form of his mother that he apparently has the hots for was a big reason for Barnabas getting on side. The point is, a lot of Ultima's philosophy is repeated through Barnabas as his earthly mouthpiece. They both believe that all of the evils and woes of humanity stem from free will, and that salvation is found in the equality of abolishing all consciousness. Clive takes up the individualist position in that debate, declaring that as his own person, he is inherently valuable. Even if Clive isn't perfectly equal to everyone else, that doesn't matter. His friends and his family are also individuals. They're different from him, and while that makes them not equals, since some are better in some ways and some are worse, that inequality doesn't actually matter. What matters is their relationships. Final Fantasy XVI presents the utopian equality of Ultima as being equivalent to the real world of the atomized individual, where everyone is isolated, everyone is interchangeable, and everyone is the same. While Clive's connections to Jill and Joshua and everyone else are rooted in individualism, they're not all the same, and that's why they can have relationships with each other, because they're not equal. They have complementary attributes that give those connections meaning. Even though Clive is a rebel against the crown and the breaker of chains, that doesn't make Clive a leftist revolutionary hero, nor does it make Final Fantasy XVI a leftist game. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The ethics that drive Clive are equal parts liberal individualism and conservative traditional family bonds. To contrast, the ethics that drive Ultima are notions of equality, which necessitates interchangeability and disposability, and notions of utopia, which necessitates a complete wiping clean of all old orders and institutions, which is exactly what Ultima spends the whole game pursuing through his manipulation behind the scenes, goading all the various powers of Valisthea into destructive wars meant to abolish them all and create a blank slate. Again, as I've said many times in this video and on this channel in general, I don't think these people are educated enough to know what I'm talking about. But their intuition tells them to look at the Ultima storyline and say, no, this bad. They don't know why, not really, but I do. If you are the type of person to hold equality and revolution as first-order moral values, then a story where equality is depicted as lowest common denominator conformity and revolution as destructive to every good thing humans want, that would be a story that you intuitively find uncomfortable, even if you don't understand why. And Clive's focus on individualism and tradition, when revolutionary leftism is anti both of those things, is probably just as disquieting. Anyway, the game journals and the progs don't really think of the game in this way. They're not actively thinking this. Their intuition just takes them there. In the same vein, I don't think the game designers had this in mind either. I don't think that Yoshi P intended to write some anti-communist moral tale using Ultima here. It came out that way for the same reason, human intuition. It's kind of like how socialists online claim that the Federation in Star Trek is a socialist utopia because they don't use money, even though private property still clearly exists, and Roddenberry was a liberal end-of-history type utopian who made one of the most enduring pop culture communist critiques in the form of the Borg, where everyone's equal in the Borg collective. It's one of those things where reading political theory allows you to word what is going on, but it's not really necessary because you intuitively get it when you see it. The world of equality is one where everyone and everything are the same, and forced to be so because of our innate differences. The world of diversity is one where differences exist, even if those differences generate inequality, because the differences are what make relations between individuals worthwhile. In other words, it's socialism versus liberalism. And that's why leftoids are complaining about Final Fantasy XVI's story, even if they don't know why they're doing it. Anyway, that's all I've got to say about this. Thanks for being here, guys. Despite its flaws, Final Fantasy XVI is still a good game, so if you like, pick it up. Oh, actually, I forgot. The game really is 10 out of 10. It's got Hodor. That's right. All is forgiven. Game of the year, baby.